As also said, my name is Judith Clorjune. I am originally from Haiti. My family migrated to the US in 2004. And we came on a student visa and then went through a very lengthy process, very lengthy and expensive process of applying for green cards and eventually citizenship. And so going through that process was very challenging and eye-opening, and also made me realize a lot of things about the immigration system, as well as how lucky we were to even have a pathway to apply for status. And so that experience really instigated my interest in this work. And so after we eventually settled in Nashville, I left for undergrad. There I became more interested in the history of Haiti, the revolutionary history of Haiti, and Haiti's relationship to the US. And then came back to Nashville, did some work with Turk as an intern, then eventually found my way at Vanderbilt Divinity, and then went back to join the policy team at Turk. And so that's a brief overview of how I've found myself in this work. And so Turk, and I'll say a little bit about what we do, is again the Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition. Turk was founded in 2003, and we primarily work to build power, amplify the voices of immigrants and refugees in Tennessee, and make sure that we are slowly changing our state to one where everyone can thrive, regardless of your nationality, your immigration status, your race, etc. And so our work primarily focuses on organizing immigrant communities, civic engagement, policy work. So we partner with a lot of different national organizations to work on policies at the national level, as well as do a lot of work at the state legislature, as well as the local level. And so right now, the big focus of my work is the state legislature that is currently in session. So if y'all have questions on that, we can also touch on that later. Yeah, and so for today's conversation, I really want to have an open conversation about the US immigration system, specifically as it pertains to the treatment of Haitians and Black immigrants. And so I'll start briefly talking about where we are, what's been happening, and then talk about why, and maybe also get to talk about, what are some of the options, where do we go from here? And as was already said, afterwards we'll have a good section of time to have questions and have an open conversation. And so I know there's a lot of experts in the room, and so don't want to, yeah, I want us to have plenty of time to also hear from people in the audience and from others who can share about their expertise. Yeah, so in the fall of last year, I believe in September, pictures surfaced of thousands of Black migrants, specifically Haitian migrants, who were in Del Rio at the border. And they were being met by Border Patrol agents on horses. And the pictures really captured the country's attention because of the cruelty that was portrayed in those images. And so a lot of people were shocked for many reasons, shocked by why migrants were being met by this this apparent cruelty, and also why were so many Black people at the border? What was happening? And for me, as someone who does this work, and also as a Haitian, it was really heartbreaking to see those images and understanding that very well could have been me and my family if we weren't so lucky. And so yeah, so that moment really brought a lot of questions and issues to the surface. And so for today, I want to talk about what exactly was happening and why those folks were being treated the way that they were. And so before I go forward, I also want to say that since September of last year, the media has moved on. I think most folks have moved on. However, the thousands of migrants who were at the border, most of them, if the majority of them, have been deported by the Biden administration. And I believe since last Friday, this Friday, there was a flight that left Laredo, Texas, and that was President Biden's 199th flight to Haiti, expelling about roughly 20,000 Haitians since February of 2001. And so really want folks to keep in mind that fact and that number, especially in light of the conversation about how this new administration was going to change the immigration system. However, for Haitians, that has not been the case. And so and also taking into account that those 20,000 folks who have been expelled or deported back to Haiti, that is in the context that Haiti has, in addition to the 2010 earthquake that the country has still not recovered from, Haiti has also suffered the assassination of its president in July of last year, as well as the 7.2 earthquake in August of last year, followed by a tropical storm. Currently, the investigation around the murder of the president hasn't been solved, and so there's a lot of political unrest that is happening in Haiti, more so than a lot of folks have seen in recent years. And so this brings us to a question of, why exactly is the US responding this way, and how are they, how is this happening? And so that brings us to a policy called Title 42. So, and again, apologies for my coughing. If you all need me to repeat something or you can't hear me, please flag for me and I will be sure to do so. But during the Trump administration, there were a number of rollbacks and changes to asylum laws. For example, changing the requirements, saying that domestic violence no longer counted, etc. But also, as part of a lot of those changes, I believe in March of 2020, they instituted a change called Title 42, which essentially enables the government to exclude or prevent people from coming based on this idea that there is a serious health danger. So the rule allows custom officers and Border Patrol to prevent people from seeking asylum based on this idea that they pose danger to the health of the country. However, we also know that while this rule has been implemented under the guise of health and safety, there's also been port of entries remain open. Nearly 11 million people have crossed and entered the country, and so we have that, and then we also have this this narrative that Title 42 is needed for public health reasons, which is clearly not consistent, at the very least, not consistent. And so that has been really, just really shocking to see how that is being used to just blatantly deny people the right to seek asylum, right? That traditionally this is a right that folks have, that you can come to the border, can seek asylum. However, with Title 42, the government is essentially saying that, no, we are not going to allow you to seek asylum. And the Biden administration is currently in courts defending Title 42 and working to uphold that, even though it was initially instated by the Trump administration. And so I also want to jump a little bit further to look at just the general treatment of Black immigrants, right? That in addition to what we see with Title 42, we also see that Black immigrants in general, including, Haitians, are disproportionately targeted and deported by our immigration system. I believe, let's see if I have the number. Yeah, I believe so. While 7% of non-citizens in the US are Black, they make up, Black immigrants make up 20% of those who are facing deportation on criminal grounds. And also, if I believe Racist Texas did this study looking at the bond amounts for Haitians and Black immigrants and found that bonds for Haitians specifically were about 54% higher than other immigrants. We also look at the time that immigrants are detained. That is also high. The times that Black immigrants are detained, that's also higher than others. And so in general, we see this pattern and this trend that Black immigrants are being disproportionately deported, detained at higher rates than other immigrants. And also going back a bit further, asking how long has this been happening? Where is this coming from? And so I believe in the 1980s, the US in general had a policy of parole where people seeking asylum were not detained. But were eventually released. And so after, I believe a lot of things were happening with the Duvalier era and all of that, and I won't go into that. But the US saw a rise in the number of Haitian refugees who were coming and seeking asylum. And a lot of those laws were suddenly changed to enable the US government to detain and hold people and eventually prevent a lot of those Haitians who are seeking asylum from being able to get that. And we also see there is a lot of differences between how those Haitians were being treated versus how a lot of the Cuban refugees were being treated and all of that. And so all of that to say is that when we look at the relationship between Haiti and the US, and also the ways that Black immigrants have been treated, it raises the question of, it brings us to just the unfortunate reality that the US immigration system is just deeply anti-Black. And also looking at from the get-go, right, that our immigration system, and not only our immigration system, but also our laws around citizenship have been about ways to control who gets to be called an American. And so we can go as far back as we can and look at the ways that formerly enslaved Black Africans were, there was a conversation around whether they were going to become American citizens or not, right? That was also a struggle. And then we can look at the Chinese Exclusion Act and all of the ways that our immigration policies and our immigration systems have been about really controlling who can be called an American and who has access. And also looking at the ways that anti-Blackness has continually shaped that and shown up. And also looking at what Haiti represents to the US, right? Again, going back further with what the Haitian Revolution meant to this country, right? For a country of enslaved Africans to claim freedom, to claim independence, while others were still being enslaved, and just the threat that represented for countries like the US and France and others. And so from the start, there's been this deeply ingrained fear of Haiti and what it represents, as well as, yeah. And so that, yeah, I think that is the core of the conversation that we must always come back to as we look at how Black immigrants are being treated, right? We must also ask the question of why is this happening and what exactly is it telling us about the US immigration system? And so the other question that we must ask is also, right, what do we do, right? What can we do in this moment at this point? And so first, I think for me in this work, really we need to radically change our immigration system. We need to radically change our enforcement policies, including abolishing ICE and making sure that we are treating Black immigrants with dignity. And so that means not deporting people who are seeking safety and seeking refuge and sending them to a country that many of them either don't have a close connection to anymore, because again, with a lot of the migrants who are coming, a lot of the Haitian migrants who are coming, many of them have lived in Brazil and other countries, and we can go into that a bit later. But yeah, making sure that we are welcoming people with dignity and moving away from this legacy of anti-Blackness that has historically shaped and directed our immigration policies. And as well as abolishing Title 42. I think that is a very pressing need right now, because there are thousands of people who are still seeking safety, who need asylum, and yet the US continues to use this policy as a way to deny a human right that folks have. And so those are some of the really, I would say, top line things that the US can do right now to make sure that we are taking a new direction with our immigration system. So I know I've been speaking, I think, for quite a bit. And so I do want to pause at this point and maybe pass it to Jesus and want to open the conversation, yeah, for questions that folks have and other comments that others may want to make.
Thank you, Judith. And can we give her a hand? Thank you. Thank you for that, Judith. I'm going to look up there because that's what I was told to do. Before I begin, Judith, as you know, as a former USCIS employee officer, I do have to just really briefly say that anything that I talk about today is my opinion, and my opinion only, and rooted in my own academic experiences and just my broader experiences working for the US government. So I do need to just mention that. Judith, thank you so much. One of the things that immediately sticks out to me from your talk, and we've talked about this, you and I, is this question of anti-Blackness, right? And so I wanna bring that, I wanna circle back to that, because I think that in the context of this meeting here and this week, right? I mean, and this month, Black History Month. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I pull from your work and from your presentation is that we're talking about so many intersections here, right? So I want to, you know, we don't need to go into the entire historical context, right? But I want you to talk a little bit more about how in your work with the various immigrant communities that you work with, how that has been a topic even within communities of color, right? Immigrant communities. I mean, what we're seeing in Mexico, for instance, happen against Haitian migrants, right? And the violence that is enacted upon them in Mexico, right? And how that affects sort of not just their sort of their trek, right, in a very practical and literal sense, but how this is a wider issue even within the United States. And then later on, maybe we can get a little bit more into the, well, actually, in the United States, let's just do it right now in the interest of time, and in the context of Tennessee, right, of the U.S. South, which is where we are, right? So I want you to talk a little bit more about that, if you would, please.
Yeah, that's a very crucial question, and thank you for bringing that up. So there's a couple of things that I want to mention. So I believe in October of last year, I believe, if I'm getting my dates right, there's a senior advisor in the Biden administration whose name is Harold Koh, resigned in response to what was happening to Haitian migrants. And in his memo, and his resignation memo, I have his quote here, but he said that our recent efforts to assist, essentially, I'll paraphrase, our response to Afghan refugees stand in contrast to our treatment and response to Haitian refugees, right? That there's a lot that the US could do for Haitian refugees that we're seeing that the US can do and is doing for other folks that it's not doing. And that's really deplorable and shameful, that we are choosing to mistreat and deny just basic dignity to a lot of Haitian migrants. And so there's that piece that I want to highlight about just the ways that anti-Blackness continues to show up in our responses to folks. And then also the reality that anti-Blackness is like a global reality, right? That's not just something that Haitian migrants deal with when coming to the US, when arriving here, but as you mentioned, all over the world. So there's also the question that I mentioned earlier, right? That a lot of the migrants that we are seeing coming, they're not recent refugees from Haiti, right? Many of them left after the 2010 earthquake, went to Brazil and other countries in Latin America, and then have had to move and migrate for a lot of political reasons, but also a lot of anti-Blackness that folks have been facing. And so those are a couple of things. And the other thing I will bring to light, so at Turk, right, part of our work is to also make sure that we are not just working with Tennesseans and non-immigrants to educate them and make sure they understand, but also that we are building solidarity within the immigrant communities at large. And that has to mean having the conversation about anti-Blackness within non-Black immigrant communities. And yeah, recently we've had some really interesting and powerful conversations where non-Black immigrants are talking about the ways that anti-Blackness show up in their families and in the stereotypes that they hold about Black people. And so I think, yeah, that question is relevant in multiple facets, right? One, we can look at the ways that Black immigrants are generally invisibilized in the immigrant rights movement at large. And I think that speaks to, the reality of anti-Blackness within immigrant communities themselves. And then there's the aspect of how this country, the US government, has chosen to respond to Black migrants and Haitian migrants and others, and just the inhumane response that we've seen. So it's an unfortunate reality, and one that we can't move on. We can't have a new, more humane immigration system until we actually deal with this reality.
Thank you. Yeah, I think one of the really interesting things, Judith, is that I'm kind of gathering here is that this is a hemispheric issue, right? White supremacy, anti-Blackness, but it's also a global issue, right? There's a way in which Cameroonian asylum seekers are treated that, I don't know, Ukrainian asylum seekers, right? Not to get into the hot topics of the day, but are treated, right? And so there is something there that is global and hemispheric for the purposes of today, right? And the CLAC and the CLAC Center and the BCC here in Vanderbilt and sort of the broader Nashville community. I think that there's a way in which your work, I think, really illustrates how those issues, white supremacy, anti-Blackness, right, and sort of colorism, if you will, within communities of migrant communities of color, works that intersects with the very issues that we are talking about with regards to Black History Month, right? CRT right now is sort of being I mean, literally legislated and banned and yes. Right in various states and in the South, and so I want you to talk a little bit more about, because it is so strong in the work that you do at Turk, right, and what you're telling me now or what you're telling us, right, and thinking about solidarities, intersectionality, right. I want you to if you could talk to us a little bit more about how all of these intersections kind of inform the work that you do there at Turk or how they sort of play out.
Yeah. So let's see. I mean, yeah, you're absolutely right that none of this, in order to actually have policies that address the root issues, we can't take any of this in silo, right? We can't fix, if that's even possible, fix our immigration system without understanding the intersections and how all these things are built on a legacy of anti-Blackness. So I think what comes to mind when you ask that question is, right, I start looking back at how and why our immigration system exists the way it is. So from the get-go of trying to control who is an American citizen, then to controlling who gets access to this country with the Chinese Exclusion Act and others, and with the 1980s and the change in the asylum laws, right? It's always been about like trying to protect this boundary of whiteness, of keeping this country, white, and even if it was a stolen land, and that's a whole other route. But like that is the history and the sort of the current that has shaped our immigration system. And so I think we have to do this work with that understanding of, this is the ground or the landscape that we're working in. And
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So this is what we're working in. And I think when looking at what are the policies that we need to push for? Who are the people that get represented? Who are the stories that get highlighted? Who are the people that get funding? Who are the people that have access to lawyers and attorneys, right? For example, there are a couple of Haitian families who have made their way to Nashville. And a lot of them were at the border and made the trek. But it's been such a hard time finding attorneys and finding resources. So looking at all these things, we have to understand that the system was constructed and designed such that Black immigrants, such that there's a group of people who don't have access. And so, I think those are the intersections that we have to keep in mind as we do this work.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. One of the things that you're saying there, that it brings me back to, so we had a speaker here, Judith, was it last fall, Jason De Leon, whose work looks at the Sonoran Desert, in Arizona and sort of Sonora in Mexico, and the ways that DHS has literally created a system of deterrence, right? That forces migrants to cross this terrible hostile terrain, and essentially leads them into their own deaths, right? What I find really interesting is that that's a system that in many ways, what you're pointing out is that in many ways it's rooted in a longer history of immigration struggle by Afro-diasporic communities, right? From the Americas, also throughout the world, but particularly in the Americas, right? In the in sort of, if we're looking at it in a hemispheric context. And there's a way that Cubans, right, in the sort of the post-revolutionary period and into the 90s, are granted entry into the United States, right, that in many ways resonates with what we're seeing today, right? Again, with, off the top of my head, Venezuelan asylum seekers, right? And how their claims are in many ways almost automatically more valid, right? Because of the politics, right? And so there's I think your work is so important in helping us understand that sort of, that connecting line, right? However, I think that what's really, I think one of the things that we're seeing, and you can, Judith, you can chime in here, but is that now, for instance, Cubans, right? And we had a talk here about the situation there most recently. There's a way in which Afro-Cubans are now being treated, right? That has made it much more difficult for them to gain entry here into the United States, right? And so now they're kind of, even Cubans themselves, who historically have been sort of, had more access entering the country, are now finding it just as difficult, right? As some of the other kind of Afro-Caribbean people. So I just wanted to make that comment because I do think that what you're doing, what you're talking to us about today and the work that you're doing at Turk here in Nashville really is painting or making those connections, right? Those historical connections. I know you're a history student as sort of as your background, right? And I know you Vanderbilt Divinity School as well, but so I know that that's sort of inextricably part of your training. But so yeah, I don't know if you want to add anything to that. We got about 20 minutes left, so if you wanted to add something to that, please. But if not, we can also open it up to the audience.
Yeah, I would say something that comes to mind when you say that is, so looking at the refugee settlement program in the US, and how its popularity has waned. And there's a big correlation between who the refugees are, and, yeah, so I think there's a just deeply rooted fear, white supremacy, white supremacy, right? And the fear of Black and brown people coming into this country, and what that means for the future of this country, again, for who is or gets access to America or gets to be called American. Yeah, and so to your point about Cuban refugees, Afro-Cuban refugees are now facing a different treatment. I think if we look back far enough, we can see that trend of how Black and brown folks in those different waves of people have been, the treatment changes, right? When it's dealing with Black immigrants, brown immigrants. And so, yeah, I think that has to be, yeah, that's a trend that we have to keep in mind.
Absolutely. Thank you, Judith. I couldn't agree more. I do want to give time and open the room or the mic up for questions from the audience. So we got, let's do two at a time. Is that okay, Judith?
Yes, yes.
So we got Brandon over here. Anybody else? And Brandon, if you could just really briefly introduce yourself to Judith. I don't know if she can see you, but.
Hi, Judith. My name is Brandon Bird. I'm in the history department here at Vanderbilt. First, thanks so much for this conversation. Really, really important stuff, and appreciate the work that you're doing here. So you mentioned what I imagine is the very difficult work of trying to build solidarities among immigrant communities here locally. So I wonder if there's a relationship, a similar parallel relationship or work of building solidarities amongst or within Black Nashville, amongst the quote unquote Native population and the immigrant population of Black folks, whether that is work that you take on or whether you see folks, Black Nashville Assembly or, maybe organization taking on. And if not, is that work that you would see as fruitful, and what might that look like?
Mm-hmm.
Do we have, sorry, Judith, do we have another question? Anybody that wants? Okay, we'll give people a little more time, but so go ahead, Judith.
Yeah, so that is absolutely necessary and fruitful work. So we at Turk, we have the Black Immigrant Caucus, and it's a sort of organizing group specifically for Black immigrants talking about being Black in this country, and also the experience of being an immigrant and having both of those identities. But so, yeah, when I think there's a lot, right? There's a lot in that question. One of which is, so talking about anti-Blackness, I think there's also those internalized ideas within Black immigrant communities themselves, right? And that's something that we also have to unroot. And something that and I've said to a lot of folks in this group as well, is when a police officer pulls me over, I'm Black. There isn't a distinction that, oh, she's a Black immigrant, she's from Haiti, blah, blah, blah. I'm a Black woman, right. And so there has to be that solidarity. Black immigrants are not excluded from that. And also, right, African Americans, and I use that as in people who have ancestry and grew up / were born here. There is a different history, there's a different culture that has to be respected and learn from. And I think that is part of the work to make sure that Black immigrants really understand the long legacy and long history of struggle that African Americans, Black folks in this country have led for so long. And also understand our role in the fight today, right? That while my grandparents may not have been in this country being part of the fight, they were in a different country, in a different struggle, or in a different place, but it is part of the same struggle against white supremacy. And so coming here, we have to make sure that our communities are united in that. And, there is still a lot of work to be done. And I think there is still a lot of separation for a lot of reasons, most of which deal with anti-Blackness, internalized or otherwise. But yeah, to your question, absolutely yes, that has to be part of the work moving forward.
And one of the things that I'm reminded of now with Brandon's question and Judith, your comments, is the Dominican Republic is literally building a wall, right? A border wall with Haiti, right? So to your point, Judith, there's this internalization, and again, we're talking about these colonial legacies, right? And the way that race is sort of, there's a through line, right, up until today, right? But what happens when a Dominican of African descent is driving around in the Bronx and gets pulled over by an NYPD officer, right? So to your point, these conversations need to be, I think, at the forefront, right, of the immigrant community, right? Because it is, I think, at the center. And I think Haiti, in that sense, is sort of it allows us to glean lessons, right, from the experience of Haitian asylum seekers or Haitian, diasporic peoples, that there's so much to learn, not just within sort of the history of immigration to the United States, but how the systems themselves that we are now seeing, right, with DHS and ICE and CBP, in many ways come from that that clash, if you will, or that violence, right, that Haitians experienced, as you said, in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, coming to the United States, right? So yes, we have another question, Avery.
Can you hear? Yeah.
I think so.
Okay. Hi, Judith. Thanks so much for this discussion. I would like to hear a little bit more about Title 42 and just kind of, have you seen that disproportionately applied to Haitian immigrants, or is it something that's being used, against Central American immigrants and other groups? And I'd also love to hear like what you think the future holds. Is that something that you all, and activist groups are going to be able to help encourage the removal of, or is that, a really hard fight?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So to my knowledge, so Title 42 essentially is part, I believe it's an aspect of US health law. Not an attorney, I will make that caveat. So yeah, we can, if you want more resources, I can share some later. But yeah, part of US health law, and it enables the government to say that when someone presents serious danger or public health danger, that they can prevent that person from coming in the country. But the way that it's been used has been to prevent a lot of asylum seekers, especially a lot of Black asylum seekers, Haitian asylum seekers who have been coming recently from accessing asylum. It has also been used not just on Black immigrants and non-Haitians, but on others who are also seeking asylum. And I believe about 1.2 million people have been excluded since the pandemic using Title 42. Yeah, so where do we go from here? So as I mentioned earlier, for a brief period of time, Title 42 was challenged in the courts, but then there was an appeal process. And so it is back in use in the government. The Biden administration is currently fighting to continue the use of Title 42. So I would say we have to stop Title 42. Like that is I think a clear direction that must be done. The ways that this has been used to deny people their basic human right is shameful and deplorable. So that, I think that is a critical next step that has to be done. And so a lot of advocates, a lot of national organizations, local organizations like us are working together to pressure the Biden administration to put a stop to Title 42. Unfortunately, they have yet to listen. But that is a continued project and initiative that is happening right now. And forgive me, I believe there was a second part of your question that I'm blanking on.
That was it. Yeah. What do you do? Thank you so much.
I think that was it, Judith.
Okay, okay.
I think, Judith, correct me if I'm wrong, but at least one federal judge found Title 42 actually illegal, right? And that's what prompted the entire appeals process. So yeah.
Yeah, I believe in October, or I'm blanking on the dates, but at some point last year, for a couple months, there was a hold on it because, as you said, that judge found it to be like not the right usage, and then another judge pulled a hold on that order and reinstated it. Yeah,
and there's one of the things that you mentioned earlier, Judith, is that the U.S. government itself has acknowledged, right, the political turmoil that has happened in Haiti with the assassination, with the opposition movements, right? Which, by the way, like massive opposition movements, right? And there's a way in which a Haitian asylum seeker's claim is almost depoliticized, right? In ways that Venezuelan claims, other sorts of claims are not. And so, I think Title 42 is part of a sort of a grant, it's part of a broader geopolitical sort of strategic U.S. Relationship that is, again, as you point out, right, is in many ways linked to the country's sort of invasion, right, of Haiti, which I think tomorrow, our speaker tomorrow is going to be presenting her book, which is about the U.S. invasion, right, of Haiti. So these, Judith, I think what I've learned here and from your work in the community here is that we cannot separate, right, the sort of the entwined character of U.S. history, the U.S. history of white supremacy, with the ways in which U.S. sort of geopolitical interest, in this case in the Caribbean, has intersected with the very immigration systems that we're seeing now that affects Salvadorans, Mexicans, right, the Dominicans themselves, right, but how we can sort of take the case of Haiti as a primer or as an example of, that contains all of these lessons, if that makes sense. Yeah, obviously I'm a little biased here, but
no, I mean, yeah, I think this we talked briefly about this when you and I talked last week, right? That we have to hold these two things in tension when looking at what to do next, right? There is the ways that the U.S. is treating and receiving or not receiving Haitian migrants. And not just Haitian migrants, but Black migrants from South America and brown folks and indigenous folks and so many others. And then we also have to look at why people are leaving and the long history of imperialism and U.S. involvement in those countries' politics. And for Haiti, going back to the very beginning, with the refusal for so many countries to accept Haiti's independence, and as you mentioned a few minutes ago, the invasion of Haiti or occupation of Haiti in around 1915. So there is all of that, right? That the U.S. has had a direct hand in those countries' political realities, in contributing to where we are now, and also we're saying, hey, we don't want Black and brown people here, where we've been so involved in those countries. So yeah, it's, it is, such a clear piece of white supremacy, in this country's treatment of Black and brown folks, or refusal to accept our ability, our dignity and our humanity to lead ourselves and to determine our own futures.
Absolutely. We have, I'm sorry to cut you off. We have one more, maybe one more. I think we have time for maybe one more after, but we have a question from Celso.
Hi, Judith. So early on, you mentioned the state legislature in passing. Can you kind of circle back and just give us a sense of what policy advocacy and just from a layperson's perspective, it seems like we're in a tough spot here. And so if you can just kind of give us some insights, like this is the way to go and this is the way to engage and from what you're doing. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I'll give a couple of ways that folks could engage. So one thing that is not related to the state legislature, but really important, is the Black Immigrant Bail Fund. So as I mentioned earlier, bail for Black immigrants, for Haitians, are typically a lot higher, I believe 42% higher than other immigrants. And so a lot of folks are held in detention because they just can't afford the bail. And so contributing to that, if possible, that's one. Getting involved with local organizations like Turk and others. There's always work to be done, right? We are working with national folks in a lot of the national initiatives, as well as trying to figure out how we change state and local policies to be more welcoming, and not just welcoming, but really affirm the dignity of immigrants. And so right now for Turk, a big part of our work is the state legislature, and so since its founding, I believe Turk has defeated about 250, if not more, anti-immigrant and anti-refugee bills. This year, we have about 10 or so, one of which, for example, is to relocate undocumented immigrants to Biden and Harris's home states. It's absolutely absurd. There is another one that is trying to, start a challenge to Plyler veto, which is the Supreme Court case that guarantees undocumented kids access to public education. And so the bill is unconstitutional, but trying to bring that challenge and saying that undocumented kids should not have access to public education in Tennessee. There are some that is trying to criminalize the movement of unaccompanied minors or unaccompanied children. There's some around E-Verify, which is, again, a program that I believe a federal program that employers have to use to verify someone's immigration status, but just it's filled with errors and causes a lot of harm in that way. So those are only a few of the bills that we're fighting this session. So there's a lot of work. And so for folks who do live in Tennessee, we are always looking for folks who are willing to contact their legislators, really being vocal about where they stand, because we, unfortunately, our legislators, many of them use anti-immigrant rhetorics or introduce anti-immigrant policies to motivate their base. And so I think that's something we see a lot, where Tennessee is almost like a test case for a lot of anti-immigrant policies before they spread out to other states. So if someone is interested, please contact Turk. You can follow us on social media or sign up on our website. There's a lot of work happening around policy advocacy at the state level, but also at the local level. We have some more proactive campaigns, for example, around municipal IDs, trying to get cities to introduce a form of ID that is accessible for folks who do not have documentation, as well as some other more proactive campaigns around professional licenses for undocumented folks. So yes, we love to, if you want to get connected, we would love it. There is a lot of work to do on multiple fronts. And I will also leave my email I can share my email so that if someone wants, you can feel free to get in contact with me also.
Thank you. I think that's actually a perfect place to leave it. We're right before the 1:30 mark. So Judith, thank you so much. I just want to commend you on your work here in the community, and just for bridging that divide with the academic circles and the local communities. That's always so important. So thank you. I think.
Thank you all. Thanks for having me.